I'm happy to take questions throughout as well as at the end and during the discussion period. So just to give you a little bit more background on who I am, I'm in the very tail end phases of my PhD at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability. John Robinson is my supervisor there. I also have worked with Stephen Shepard and Stuart Cohen in the Faculty of Forestry at the Collaborative for Advanced Landscape Planning on the local climate change visioning project. So I've been doing that for the last couple of years. And my own work also deals with community-level climate change responses, institutional barriers to action in cities. So we've studied Delta and the District of North Vancouver and the City of Vancouver, and we'll be going through some of that today. So this is my little outline, pretty sketchy, but I'd like to walk you through some of the work we've done and consider some of the impacts that we might see in various areas in Metro Vancouver focused on Delta. At the risk of belaboring what I'm sure you all already know, I'm going to give a little bit of background on climate change just to bring everybody up to speed in case there's any issues that we need to sort of fill in the blanks for. I'm going to introduce the framework for our research that we did at the local climate change visioning project. Provide you with some of the visions of a changing climate. I like to call this the flood, fire, and pestilence element. Not to make it too dramatic, but these are sort of the images of the impacts and responses that we can see in these communities. And then just present some of our findings. So what did we learn from the communities that we spoke with? What were the responses we got to these images? And where do we think we're going to go from here? So here it is, the greenhouse effect. Pretty sure you're all familiar with this. But in a normal circumstance, the radiation comes in from the sun, through the atmosphere, hits the earth, and is absorbed by the earth. It's re-radiated back and creates a heating effect. So we have this lush, wet, growing planet instead of an ice cube. And some of that heat typically escapes back out into space, and some of it bounces back off the atmosphere back down towards the Earth's surface and is trapped there. We're of course adding to this layer that's insulating the planet, these greenhouse gases that are preventing the escape of radiation back out into space and causing enhanced warming. So obviously, as you all know, the warming that we obviously want some of this warming to go on in our planet, but we're just sort of making it worse and with undesired effects. And again here, just to bring everybody onto the same page with regard to language, I'm continually amazed that even people that work in the climate change field have different sort of definitions for these words. So obviously impacts is quite clear. It's just what we're going to see as a result of a changing climate. And then response options are usually grouped into two different categories, adaptation and mitigation. We're here mainly to talk about adaptation, of course, which just means dealing with the effects of climate change. So protecting ourselves against the impacts of climate change that we think will happen or are already happening. Mitigation, on the other hand, and mitigation especially is a word that has lots of different meanings, and hazard reduction and remediation, reclamation, all of this kind of thing. But in the context of climate change, mitigation means getting at the root of the problem, dealing with the cause of climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So in an ideal world, those impacts wouldn't even happen. And here's a little chart that came out in 2006. Sir Nicholas Stern, this is called the Stern Review. He's an economist from London, and he did this fantastic analysis that coincided partly with the Panel on Climate Change. Sorry, science report. And his purpose was to show the economic case for responding to climate change, for mitigating climate change. One of the common criticisms of people who are arguing for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through Kyoto and other mechanisms was that it would cost way, way too much. And this report essentially proved otherwise, that it would cost too much not to respond to climate change. And there's a couple impacts here that I'd like to draw out just because they're relevant and in the news and all of that. You may recall in our distant memories of about a year ago, pre-global economic crisis, there were massive food shortages and still are, and food prices skyrocketed. And this is one of the impacts that we'd expect to see with around 2 degrees of warming. And another one that's really relevant for what we're talking about today, at around degrees of warming, this is a massive range, 7 to 300 million additional environmental refugees circulating the globe looking for a place to be, who had previously lived in vulnerable areas that are being impacted by extreme events, rising sea levels, flooding, that sort of thing. So this just shows the fact that, a lot of scientists now are saying 2 degrees is this threshold, right? Climate change becomes dangerous, potentially catastrophic, beyond 2 degrees of warming. But, our emissions are on track to go considerably beyond that. And I should note also that, since the release of the IPCC report, all evidence shows, that the IPCC report cuts off its literature that it reviews. It has to cut it off 2 years or a year and a half before the publication of the report. New stuff that's come out since then has almost universally shown that the estimates of the impacts presented by the IPCC were very, very conservative. Increasing glacial melt, higher sea level rise estimates, that sort of thing. Not to be too dire here. This is a chart that shows, that speaks to specifically the infrastructure and extreme events issue that we're talking about today from Swiss Re. This just shows a trend from 1970 all the way to 2004 of the increasing severity and frequency of weather events, and also the costs related to that, so the insurance-related costs associated with increasing severity of weather events. Now there's 2 reasons we have to be clear that this pattern could be seen of dramatically increasing costs. One, we're developing in places we shouldn't be developing in. So all around the world, we're developing in highly vulnerable, low-lying areas and putting billions and billions of dollars into these places, and then they get hit by hurricanes. And also that the hurricanes are increasing in severity and frequency. So there's the weather signal, and then there's also irresponsible development patterns, in my view. So this is observed data. This isn't a projection. This isn't a model. This is what we've seen over the last 30 years. And, these kinds of observations abound. We know that climate change is happening. It's not a future thing. So what do we do with this? How do we grapple? The impacts seem to come to bear on all aspects of our culture and our economy and our ecosystems. So a couple of attempts have been made to make sense of this for people. One of them was The Day After Tomorrow, which was widely seen pre-Al Gore, and was this disaster scenario, very dramatic, the images of wolves going down the streets of New York, and it instantly freezes into an ice cube. Anyway, lots of crazy scenarios. But nevertheless, it introduced an interesting audience to potential climate change impacts that had never really considered this before. These images, I believe, were in an Inconvenient Truth. Vanity Fair picked them up in one of its green issues. And the point is to show these really emotional places for Americans, iconic spaces with impacts of climate change, to try and bring it home, to try and make it relevant to people here instead of just a phenomenon that happens in Bangladesh or in Sudan. But the question arises, when would this happen? When would we see this in BC? Is this a likely scenario? Is this rooted in science? Not entirely. That was a big criticism. Are you showing us images of 300 years from now? And if so, why do we care? So, at the Collaborative for Advanced Landscape Planning, Stephen Shepard et al. Designed this project to try to use visual imagery to communicate science in a way that was local, that was powerful, that was intuitively, easy to understand, but that was also really tightly linked to the best available global, regional, local science. So let's take this image, so let's start at the bottom actually. This is sort of a typical graph. I don't know how well you can see it. We're actually turning the lights, but this is the typical presentation of scientific information. So this is a climate model looking ahead into 2100 and showing the elevation of the snow line on the North Shore Mountains going into the future. In a high emissions scenario, what would we expect to see? Where would that snow line be? I don't know about you, but this graph here doesn't mean all that much to me. I get that there's something happening, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. But if we render through the image of the North Shore Mountains, And then we go through time to 2020, 2050, and 2100. That, to me, makes it much more clear. I see Grouse Mountain beginning to be exposed at April 1st. I see the snow line rising up the mountain. Those are iconic mountains for Metro Vancouver. They sort of overshadow our whole community here. And I understand something about what's going on there with the snow level. Can you give me a halfway? Yes. So we can think about it in another way. You know, what does that rising snow line actually mean? Well, these are the mountains from which we get our water. So let's look from above and try a different way of envisioning this this impact and see what we get from it in terms of our water supply, 2020, 2050, and 2100. So in general, the people that we've shown these images to, people who are not utilities managers, not practitioners or experts of any kind, they just kind of get it. You know, they get that this is a potential impact for Metro Vancouver. So this is kind of the framework. You know, this is the general idea. This project was based on this theoretical basis. We wanted to disclose as much of the science as possible. You know, use a defensible amount of drama. So we don't want to, you know, show these animated images of people running down streets with floods, you know, racing behind them, or burning homes, or crazy, you know, strike fear into the heart of people kind of imagery. But we do want to use the power of imagery to show what's quite likely or what is scientifically defensible. And then these 4 points are, you know, these are our goals. We want to localize it. We want to bring science home to our backyard, so we can see it in our own community, in our own neighborhood. We want to make it spatial instead of little points on a graph, numbers on a chart. We want to visualize it so we can actually, as I said, picture our neighborhoods with this scenario. And we want to personalize it, bring it down to the individual, and also the individual planner, the individual engineer, the individual policymaker, so that they can actually sort through what this means for their city. And this is an example of where we started to head with it. You know, this is a familiar image to many, Burnaby corridor, or Kingsway corridor, sorry, in Burnaby. This is as it stands today, wide streets, kind of semi-commercial. But what would this look like in the future if we decided to develop it sustainably, adapt to climate change, as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So this is one way that the Kingsway corridor could look if we had lots of transit, we greened it out, compact mixed-use communities. This is just a Photoshop. This is not a 3D model, you know, using data. You've actually, you can see, for those of you who are familiar, this is bits and put into Burnaby corridor. But you also see little micro turbines and cyclists and local food markets and all of that kind of thing. So we found that the public, when they see these kinds of images, generally think, wow, you know, that's a place that I'd actually prefer to live, and it's also a lower carbon scenario. So we explore these features in our communities by building this 4-world framework. Of course, there's an infinite number of worlds that we could find ourselves in, but this is just a dramatic simplification of that. On the bottom here, we have our red world 1, do nothing. This just shows us essentially what we're trying to respond to. What are we trying to adapt to? If we do nothing, what are the impacts that we'll feel in these communities? In our orange world 2, we start to adapt. So we are protecting ourselves against some of the impacts, but we're not trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions yet, ever. World 3 we call efficient development. So this is low-hanging fruit in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. Do what's easy, do what's obvious, begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and adapt. And World 4 is deep sustainability. So fundamentally transition into a sustainable development path in the long run. Low carbon, carbon neutral, also resilient and adaptable to climate change impacts, which we will see